Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Daigle. I am part of the eSource facilitation team working with Pacific Power as part of their engagement series across the great state of Washington. I'm really excited to welcome you this morning to our Clean Energy Implementation Plan engagement series. Today is June 18th, 2024. I'm going to pass the baton before we get started to Rohini for any introductory comments before we go through today's meeting logistics and agenda.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Hi, everyone. My name is Rohini Ghosh. I'm a Regulatory Projects Director here at Pacific Power. I just wanted to extend a warm welcome to everyone joining us on the line today. This is our second 2024 Clean Energy Implementation Plan series of the year. I think we've got a lot of exciting and informational content in today's engagement series for everyone. I do really welcome folks' feedback on this material. If you're not comfortable providing that or asking questions during the session, please feel free to reach out over email afterwards. And with that, I pass it back to you, Jeffrey, to kick us off.
Thanks, Rohini. So Morgan, if you could drive us to the next slide, please. So I want to first spend a moment talking about our objectives and our agenda today. So our objective today is to communicate Clean Energy Implementation Plan updates. Our second objective is to present our vulnerable population workshop objectives and review our proposed approach. There will be a discussion component that folks are welcome to chime in after that. We'll be reviewing integrated resource planning modeling and the related impacts. And then we'll learn about distribution system planning, or DSP, solutions and the engagement around that activity. So right now we are going through our purposive objectives. We'll talk about meeting logistics, etc. We'll then pass this over to Rohini for just a quick overview on where things stand with the CEIP. And then we're going to spend a long chunk of time doing discussion on the Vulnerable Populations Workshop. Laura will be great walking us through that section. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back for integrated resource planning updates, distribution system planning updates, and then we'll talk about next steps. We'll have moments available today for public comment about items that are not on today's agenda, and then we'll close the meeting. Let's jump to the next slide, please, Morgan. So I do want to note, if you did not see it when you joined today's meeting, that today is being recorded. What we do is we will cut today's recording into two sections, one pre-break, one post-break, and that will be loaded to the Pacific Power website along with notes from today's meeting. For those of you that are joining today's meeting and need Spanish or a sign language interpretation service, that's available to you. And you can access those by clicking to navigating to interpretation at the bottom of your Zoom window and selecting ASL under watch or Spanish under audio. If interpretation is missing from your list of icons at the bottom of your screen, please click the more icon or maximize your screen. We also recommend, while we're in discussions, that folks turn on their camera if they're comfortable and use the gallery view, which is an icon at the top right as part of the group discussion. Today, we've had a slight change in our instructions. For technical support, normally we tell folks to reach out to Tag, but he's unable to be here today. So please reach out to Morgan Westbury, who will help work through technical issues with you. And then I will note that questions are welcome throughout today's conversation at any time. Please remain muted unless you're speaking, and you can speak by clicking the raise hand icon in the toolbar. Again, if that's not visible to you, you can maximize the screen view or click the more icon. Next slide, please, Morgan. So there's a lot of really great content today, and that content is not created without a great set of experts across Pacific Power and PacifiCorp to be able to walk through this content. So as you've seen here, we're highlighting the folks that are presenting through today's workshop, and I'm really excited that you'll get to hear from many of these folks directly today. Next slide, please, Morgan. And with that, even though we're running a little ahead of schedule, and that's okay, I'm going to pass the baton back to Rohini to talk through the Clean Energy Implementation Plan section.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I will try to use up my full 15 minutes now. So good morning again. As I said, my name is Rohini Ghosh. I just have a few kind of high level, both review and updates on where Pacific Power currently sits in its clean energy implementation planning process. Morgan, please go to the next slide. So as I'm sure we are all very well aware, if we're here today, Pacific Power submitted its inaugural Clean Energy Implementation Plan in December of 2021. And so that filing actually kicked off our first CEIP planning or compliance window. And we are in a 4-year filing cycle. So with that first inaugural CEIP, that set the stage for the 4-year of interim targets, demand response, energy efficiency, renewable energy, as well as various customer benefit indicators that the company would begin exploring and reporting metrics against. So as part of that 4-year filing cycle, the utility is also required to submit a 2-year update. So in November of 2023, Pacific Power filed what is called the CEIP biennial update. So that represented a 2-year update to any targets that needed updating based on updated assumptions, modeling outputs, new information that's come to light. For the most part, that meant updating targets or information for the remaining years in the cycle, so 2023 through 2025. And since filing that in November of 2023, the Commission has now set an order for adjudication. And so I'll talk a little bit about that when I move to the next slide. But we do now have a full procedural schedule outlined for the adjudication of the 23 biennial CEIP update. I'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but that is something for folks to be aware of if you are following Pacific Power's progress as we move through this first CEIP period. We did update some key targets in that biennial update, and until such time that that matter is resolved through an adjudication or a settlement, the company is basically still being held to what was filed in our revised CEIP technically, so the revision to the CEIP filed in March of 2023. In that vein, while we do updates on the planning side, which is what the biennial CEIP update was, we also file an annual progress report. And so this year on July 1st of 2024, Pacific Power will be filing its second annual progress report. So we will be looking backwards and reporting on 1 year, 2023, of actual results. And so we'll take a look at how we performed against our actual clean energy interim targets, against our demand response and energy efficiency targets, as well as report some really key metrics against our customer benefit indicators. So do look out for that to be filed on July 1. As always, our updated filings and supporting documents and work papers are available on our website, and you can always find those links here or let us know if you can't find them. You can also always go to the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission's website, and that docket number is also linked here as well. Please look out for some updates from me on that progress report after we file July 1. I look forward to presenting some key takeaways and a summary in future engagement spaces. So we can go to the next slide. So there is quite a lengthy procedural schedule that has been set for adjudication, and I don't know that all of that information is as relevant. So we tried to take out some key dates here that might be most interesting for folks that are following this process along. So as I already stated, where we've been, we filed our biennial CEIP on November 1 of 2023. Since then, on January 11th, Commission staff and other interested parties did file comments, and they did recommend the approval of the biennial CEIP, but subject to specific conditions. This matter was then brought to a Commission recessed open meeting on March 22nd, 2024, and because the matter couldn't be resolved between the company and non-company parties in time for this meeting, by March 25th, 2024, the Commission suspended the matter and set it for adjudication, and that's by Order 9 in that same docket So now we've got a procedural schedule set for adjudication. The first date has actually just passed. So yesterday, Pacific Corp submitted opening testimony to this docket, and we look forward to a second settlement conference on July 11th, 2024. So the company and non-company parties are continuing to work on a settlement offer, and if we settle at any point during the adjudication, we will move to suspend the rest of the hearing and attempt to get that settlement. If not, we'll keep moving through our adjudication. And so the next kind of key deadline after the settlement conference, which is still subject to confidentiality, just so everyone knows, staff, public counsel, and other intervener response testimony and exhibits is due August 21st. So the full procedural schedule will likely go at its longest through November of 2024. So at the latest, we will have a decision on the contents and approvals of the biennial CEIP by the end of the year. So that timing is a little bit long, but don't worry. In the meantime, the company continues to move forward on its planning and its growth and updates in various other areas. I will also put in a plug that we are gearing up for planning for our 2025 CEIP. So that is officially launching our plan for the second CEIP planning window, so the next 4 years. Please look out for updates coming through the integrated resource plan, as that really sets the beginning stages of our updated modeling assumptions that will go into that portfolio, as well as some other really important developments being made in other areas, like in our CBI metrics, and how we will continue to incorporate that to the broader system. One last thing that I will also note here, there will be a public comment hearing, and this is specific to the biennial CEIP. You are always welcome to submit feedback in our broader CEIP planning process in our general docket, or you can submit comments to me in email. I'm always happy to get them. But there's a public comment hearing that will be set specific to this adjudication. There is at least a 30-day notice that has to go out, but we will likely have that date set for sometime in the fall. And I think that date is being worked on right now. So as soon as we have that information, we will update here in this engagement space as well as on our websites. So do look out for that if you think you'd be interested in submitting public comments during that time. I didn't take up the full time, but I tried. I really do welcome questions if anyone would like to come off mute and ask any questions about just the regulatory or procedural schedule or cycle for our CEIP. And if not, then I will pass it back to you, Jeffrey.
Awesome. I'm watching closely to see if anybody's coming off mute or using the raise hand, but I don't see anybody, and I don't see anyone in the chat yet. So
no worries. Well, I just want to thank everyone for being here today. And again, I really do encourage people, if they're not comfortable asking questions or raising comments in this forum, we really do welcome written feedback. Please email me. My information is at the end of this presentation, and we can record that comment or feedback. We can get responses back to you. We want to make sure that this space is collaborative. That's the point of doing this. We don't just want to talk at you and inform you, though of course it can be a lot of information. We acknowledge that. So if you take time to digest it afterwards and then you've got questions or feedback, please don't be shy. Come back with that to us. And of course, we look forward to talking to more of you in future engagement spaces. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Rohini. Next slide, please, Morgan. So for our next section, I'm going to pass the virtual baton to Laura James to talk us through the Vulnerable Population Workshop 1 before we enter into a discussion period. Welcome to the stage, Laura.
Thanks so much. Good morning, everyone. I will be heading up our first Vulnerable Populations Workshop. Next slide, Morgan. Thank you. So some quick goals for today. This is our first of a brief series of vulnerable population workshops. Our goals for today are just to share the language for settlement condition 14, which is the background for these workshops. And today we're going to focus on reviewing the background and high-level approach that PacifiCorp took when we defined vulnerable populations for our first CEIP. We'll compare our approach to some of the other utilities in Washington, and then we want to have a discussion with everyone on the line today about the approach that we took versus other possible approaches. Next slide. So first I want to touch on settlement condition 14. This condition was part of the settlement that Rohini was just describing. And I won't read the full language here, but the settlement condition asked PacifiCorp to convene up to 2 workshops with interested parties. This is the first of what we expect will be 3 workshops. And the objective of the workshops was really to review and identify possible improvements to the company's approach to how we define and are tracking vulnerable populations. So both what demographics factor into the definition and the data that we're using to identify and track impacts against those groups. The settlement also included, excuse me, the condition also included a list of specific factors that PacifiCorp was asked to consider in these workshops. We're not going to get into all of these today. Today, we're going through kind of the architecture of the methodology, if you will. And we are reserving our entire second workshop to walk through each of these factors. We want to dedicate enough time to really digging into them. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we're expecting to host 3 workshops on this topic. And the first one today is that review of our current approach that I mentioned. The next one, where we do the deeper dive into specific data, specific groups that we're including and data that we're using, will be in August. The date is still TBD. We will post that on our website as soon as it's fixed. And the link to our website is in the slide deck on this slide, if you have that. If you're interested in being notified once we do set that date, please just enter 1 in the chat right now, and we'll create a list, a notification list for that meeting. The third workshop will likely be in October. We expect that to be a presentation of the changes that we expect to make to our approach to vulnerable populations based on the first 2 workshops. So we'll kind of summarize the material that we've covered and the feedback that we received, and how we applied that feedback to our definition of vulnerable populations. We will continue to use the listserv that we put together today to notify folks about the October session as well. So make sure, if you are interested in being involved, that you put 1 in the chat. Next slide. So now I want to talk about how we did reach our approach to identifying vulnerable populations in our CEIP. The requirement to identify both highly impacted communities and vulnerable populations was part of the Clean Energy Transformation Act. There was language in the WAC 480-100 rule, which is on the slide here, about how utilities should do that. So as directed, we use the Washington Department of Health environmental health disparities analysis to identify highly impacted communities. And that is a very rigorous and specific methodology that we will take a look at in a moment. And then for vulnerable populations, the instructions or the direction to utilities was much more open. We were to work with interested parties and an advisory group in order to figure out a definition that would work for our service area. And so that is the approach we took, which I will talk a little bit more about in the next slides. Next slide. Before we get into that process, I just want to give a little bit of background on the Pacific Power service area. Pacific Power serves basically two regions within the state of Washington. One is roughly centered around Yakima, includes Toppenish and Sunnyside, and the other is centered around Walla Walla. Our service area relative to the state has a much higher percentage of Hispanic or Latino residents, much higher percentage of residents who speak other languages than English at home, higher percentage of households that are impoverished, and a higher percentage of people working in resource industries like agriculture, forestry, fishing, mining, et cetera. And so this was important background for us as we were developing our definition. Next slide. So first I want to talk a little bit about identifying highly impacted communities. I think that this is probably pretty familiar to a lot of you. You might wonder why we're talking about this when we're in a vulnerable population workshop. But as we were thinking about how to identify vulnerable populations, we were very conscious of the named communities that were already determined for us, which were these highly impacted communities. And so just to review how this worked, the Department of Health identified factors related to pollution burden and also socioeconomic population characteristics, and analyzed the prevalence of those factors by census tract across the state. The analysis also took into account what territory in the state was what they called Indian country, as defined by federal statute, to identify tribal lands. Those were the inputs to the analysis. Next slide. And using that data, they scored census tracts across the state. The Department of Health determined that any census tract that scored a 9 or 10 on using the pollution burden and socioeconomic criteria, or that was in tribal, that overlaid tribal lands, would be considered a highly impacted community. In our service area, we had 18 census tracts, primarily in Yakima, one in Walla Walla, that received a score of 9 or 10. And we had 6 census tracts that were located on tribal lands. So overall, we had 20 census tracts identified as highly impacted communities. and that included a large chunk of the Yakima area and smaller portion of the Walla Walla area. So with that in mind, we got to work on how we would think about vulnerable populations, this other group that we would pair with highly impacted communities to make up the named communities that we would that would be the target for actions we would take through the CEIP to ensure that the CEIP was equitably implemented to achieve equitable outcomes. Because we were instructed to work with an advisory group, we needed an advisory group. And so in May 2021, we convened our equity advisory group. The first meeting included 8 members. We looked for representatives from the already identified highly impacted communities. We looked for folks working on the equity issues that we wanted to target through the CEIP. And we looked through people who were actually representatives of the communities that we wanted to engage with, meaning they lived in those communities. The first meeting was in May, second meeting was in June, and we used that meeting to present some background information on PacifiCorp itself, on our service area, on the CEIP process, and specifically the process to identify vulnerable populations. We asked our advisory group members to get into groups and discuss amongst themselves what they viewed as the priority disadvantaged groups and groups facing special challenges in their communities, and then ask them to present out what they had discussed. And so we just collected kind of a brainstorming of what these representatives from the community viewed as the priority vulnerable populations and challenges facing their communities. The next meeting was in July 2021. And in that meeting, we presented our proposed list of vulnerable populations. To create that list, we took all of the information that we had received from the EAG in the prior meeting and synthesized it, grouped it, just kind of streamline and see where there was consensus across the members, and where we felt that PacifiCorp could play a role in targeting those communities. We presented our proposed list to the EAG and received additional feedback on that list, and that became our final set of vulnerable population. Next slide. This is a slide that we created following the June meeting, and this gives you a sense of the kinds of feedback that we got from EAG members during that meeting. It also gives you a sense of what I mean when I say that we were categorizing and synthesizing the information. So we identified groups including or factors including income, health, education, immigration and language, housing, location, as sort of critical factors presenting challenges to communities in our service area, and presenting issues such as financial barriers, access to information, limited income, living in multifamily or affordable housing, living in rural areas with lack of access to transportation, and other challenges that you can see here. So I just wanted to give you a sense of the kind of feedback that we were getting and how we synthesize that. Next slide. This is our current list of vulnerable populations that came out of the groups and challenges that were identified in the previous slide. We ended up with a list of 22 different populations. We identify these people in our, these households in our service area using both our own internal surveys and US Census Bureau data. We track them across the entire service area and are tracking them individually and tracking impacts on these populations individually. And I'm just going to pause. Actually, can we go back to that slide? I just want to pause for a second and give people a chance to actually read this list and see the different populations that we are tracking from 1 to 22. All right, next slide. So I mentioned before that we were tracking or that we are tracking our vulnerable populations each individually, excuse me, tracking impacts on those populations individually. For us, that created a nice kind of twofold approach to identifying named communities in our service area, because we started with the definition of HICs, which is geographic. So it's based on an indexing process to identify an intensity of the factors included in the analysis by census tract. And then our vulnerable populations were individual factors or subgroups in our population that we could track across the entire service area. So it gave us kind of a breadth and depth approach. This is an example of what that means in terms of tracking impacts. So what you're looking at is a section of our report card, our CBI report card, which is available online, that shows the percentage of energy burdened households by group with a 2020 baseline and then the 2022 metric. So when you look at these, you can compare the values for tribal lands and the broader HIC category against specific groups in our vulnerable populations. So people who are low income, people who speak limited English, renters, etc. And you can see the values change among those different groups. And you can also see the directionality from 2020 to 2022 change for those different groups. Next slide. Since we first issued our CEIP in 2021, we've been continuing to work on our process for identifying and measuring the impacts that we're having on HICs and vulnerable populations. These changes include disaggregating our reporting for HICs to separate out our impacts on tribal lands separately. We have updated our survey methodology to do a better job penetrating into the communities that we are trying to measure. So issuing surveys in both English and Spanish, using online and phone options for responding to surveys. And we have seen an increase in the response from these excuse me, vulnerable population groups. That's one of the metrics that we track actually as one of our CBIs. We have updated applications for our residential energy efficiency program to capture and low income weatherization programs to capture whether the home is a rental or homeowner occupied, and also the language that's spoken at home. We have created and published our CBI report card, which makes all of our data accessible to everyone in, we hope, easy to use Excel format. And we have been searching and have obtained a new data source that allows us to report impacts for people living on trusts, which was previously one of our vulnerable populations that we were struggling to be able to identify. Next slide. So now I want to talk a little bit about how our approach differs from what other utilities in Washington have done when it comes to naming or identifying vulnerable populations. So each utility was given the option to develop their own methodology so that their definition of vulnerable populations would reflect their service area. Both Puget Sound Energy and Avista used what we're calling a geographic definition to identify vulnerable populations. So that's similar to the HICs. It's an indexing of the prevalence of different socioeconomic or other factors across a geographic area to find the census blocks or tracts that are have most intensive need. PSE used factors that were identified through their own outreach to interested parties and crafted their own methodology. They revised that methodology in their 2023 biennial update. Those revisions included some simplification. They incorporated some additional factors related to heat risk, and they created another tier of designation, which they called their deepest need designation. Next slide. Avista also used a geographic approach. They relied on the Department of Health methodology. So they identified census tracts that had scored a 9 or 10 in either the Department of Health socioeconomic or the sensitive population categories, but had not been identified as highly impacted communities. Of 142 census tracts in their area, they identified 36 as HICs and then another 12 as vulnerable populations. So together they had 48 tracts in their named communities. In their biennial update, they stated that they plan to incorporate the White House economic justice screening tool to update their methodology in their 2025 plan. Next slide. So what are the pros and cons of geographic tracking? In these next couple of slides, I just want to walk through what PacifiCorp sees as some of the pros and cons of the two different approaches that we've been talking about here to identifying vulnerable populations. And this is really what we want to form the foundation of our discussion with you today is, are we getting this right? How is the way we think about this different from the way that you're thinking about this? So when thinking about the geographic approach, which is the basis for the HIC and also PSE and Avista's definitions of vulnerable populations, a benefit is that it allows you to synthesize across multiple demographic factors to kind of boil a bunch of statistics down into specific areas, which lets you streamline tracking. So you're not tracking so many different things for specific areas. It also focuses attention on the areas with the most intensive need from kind of a holistic perspective. And in terms of tracking impacts, it makes it easier to match impacts because you just have to identify the area in which they occurred. Some of the cons of this approach, it may sort of create pockets because it assumes that within the boundaries of the geographic area that you've drawn, there is relative homogeneity, that everyone in that group is more or less the same, at least for the specific factors that you're tracking. And it may not always be easy to draw boundaries where that is the case. It also buckets multiple explanatory factors. I mean, by nature, that's what it's doing, which means that it can be difficult when you look at trends over time to sort of identify the drivers of those outcomes. Next slide. Now switching to the single factor demographic approach that PacifiCorps used to identify vulnerable populations. There are pros and cons with this approach as well. On the con side, this approach is not targeting resources to the most intensive needs within an area. We are tracking impacts across our entire service area. It can be difficult to map impacts to specific populations. We are using survey data to do that, and so we have statistical analysis that we're reporting. That means that the accuracy of measurements varies based on those surveys, based on the size of the population, their ability to respond to a survey, factors like that. And it requires us, we have 22 vulnerable populations that we're tracking. So it's a long list of factors to be holding in your head and comparing and contrasting. On the benefit side, it's easier to see differences in outcomes by specific factors. So it's easier to see, for example, if whatever outcome you're tracking is more closely correlated to renter status or low income status or another factor. It allows us to target program design to specific subpopulations, so we can create programs that are specifically targeting renters and then track impacts on renters, for example. And every factor that we're assessing is monitored over our whole service area. So we don't have geographic pockets of folks who might otherwise have been characterized as a vulnerable population, but the group is kind of too small to qualify as its own subgroup. Next slide. So that brings us to the discussion portion of today's workshop. And there are 4 questions on the screen here. I'd like us to kind of walk through them one by one. We're really looking for feedback from folks on the phone or on the call today. So just chime in or raise your hand. I'm gonna lean on Jeffrey to help me moderate this. And we'll start with, do you agree or disagree with the pros and cons that we've just outlined for each approach?
And I'm watching both my chats and participants screen to see if anybody comes off mute or if anybody raises their hand. And it's okay to be in the middle on this question, right? I agree with some,
Absolutely.
not all, right? So.
Absolutely. And, you know, these are the questions that we thought of, but if anybody has any other comments or any other questions, feel free to bring those in and lay those on the table as well. Anybody?
This is Heather Moline from UTC. Can you hear me?
Hi,
Yes.
Heather.
I not used to this platform, so I couldn't figure out how to do things. Yeah, Heather Moline, UTC. I guess I'm wondering why it needs to be one or the other. In my head, for example, you're not going to geographically aggregate people with a hearing impairment, but you might try to identify those folks through other means, provide them with services as you become aware that they're in your service territory. Whereas some things like, historically redlined neighborhoods, absolutely, even if there are cons, should probably be approached geographically.
Yeah, sure. That's a good point. It doesn't need to be one or the other. We just noticed that was kind of the high level difference between what we had done and what other utilities had done. And each utility, reached their approach sort of organically and independent of the others. But I think you raise a good point that different factors present differently across the service area.
Thank you, Heather. Any other comments on this first question from anybody in the room? You can also feel free, if comfortable, to use the chat icon. If you're not comfortable coming off of mute, or you're not in a space where you can come off of mute without a lot of background noise, to use the chat feature to type in comments, and we'll read those to the group.
Hi, everyone. This is Charlie Thompson. I'm a policy associate with the Northwest Energy Coalition. And I just had a quick question for the PAC team. Could you explain again where the data comes from for the single factor tracking? It looked like some of it was from customer surveys and others were from national data sets. But yeah, an explanation there again would be helpful. Thanks.
Lee, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Charlie. So a lot of the demographic information that we have is not something that we typically would track, the vulnerable population to 22 different demographic characteristics. It's not something we have in our billing system. We just don't track that sort of information readily. And so we've relied pretty heavily on our residential survey. We conduct a residential survey every 2 years, roughly. And we've catered that survey, modified it so that we start acquiring more information about, our service territory, about customers in our service territory, which, kind of to the point that Laura made, is that we, any survey, you're going to have to deal with survey error and, margin of error associated with, what sort of response rate you get. So that's, that's one of the cons to going that approach. And I will say that, we also rely pretty heavily on U.S. Census Bureau, ACS, the American Community Survey data as well for certain characteristics where, that's available.
Thanks, Lee. That's helpful. And I think in earlier PacifiCorp CEIP discussions, like during the biennial update, and maybe during some of those advisory group meetings in which we were talking about how to define and expand on the population of define and expand on the definition of vulnerable populations. One thing that came up as another pro of PacifiCorp going with the single factor tracking method, as opposed to Avista and PSE going with the more geographic approaches, was it's in a way it's nice to see different approaches so we can see as we're going through future iterations of CEIPs and further progressing on our definitions of vulnerable populations. We can kind of I kind of like what Heather was saying, like we can kind of see like, is it an either or situation or is it a both situation? So I think there is that benefit of PacifiCorp going with that approach. And then I guess I support what Heather was saying, as to not to silo ourselves into one approach. Not saying we are, but I like what she said there. So.
Thanks, Charlie. Do you feel like you are seeing any lessons learned yet, looking across the 3 utilities? Not to put you on the spot, but if you have anything.
Nothing comes to mind off the top of my head, but I think I do want to look at this a little bit deeper to kind of see like what's coming of this in terms of there are different programs, there are different ways that PSE and Avista are kind of using their definition of VPs and targeting some of their different programs towards that. And I kind of want to see like, okay, in practice, how are these definitions of HICs and VPs being used, and is there one utility that is servicing customers in a different way because of those identifications, et cetera. So I think it'll probably take a deeper dive on my end and probably others here as well. But I think that's kind of one of the questions to keep in mind here as we further build on or build out these definitions. So sorry, I couldn't offer something a little bit more
no,
hearty right
that's
now.
fair. That's a good answer. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Charlie. I see Stefan has their hand raised.
Thank you very much. This is Stefan de Villiers from Public Counsel. Just a quick follow-up question on Charlie's about the source for this data. Lee, can you speak a little more to what the response rate looks like for those residential surveys?
Ooh, the weeds. Let me think. Response rate for, subject to check, I want to say it's in the neighborhood of like 5%. Like we have, it's by and large a email survey. We also have a phone aspect to that survey as well to try to reach vulnerable populations, folks that typically you don't see a high response rate for. We've tried to mitigate for that, but we're still looking at roughly a 5% response rate in Washington.
Okay, thank you.
Ballpark. I mean, I don't have the exact percentage, but it's that neck of the woods.
Thanks, Lee. And thanks, Stefan. So any other comments or questions that folks want to pose on our first question? And if not, we can jump to our second part of our discussion today.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's jump to the second question, which is, which approach do you perceive as more appropriate for identifying vulnerable populations? I think Heather kind of hinted at this at her comment earlier, but we'd love to hear from the rest of the group on any thoughts that they may have on this question.
Hey there. Can't figure out how to raise my hand. This is Elijah Cetus with Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. This is sort of a question and sort of a maybe approaching the second question more than the first, but I considered asking it for the first. But I guess how do you plan to address the single factor analysis, how do you plan to align it with the geographic sort of realities of your service territory? And this goes back to a little bit what Charlie raised, but so for example, tribal lands you have a geographic overlay for tribal lands.
Mm-hmm.
You might not get a high survey response in those tribal lands, which might lead to less analysis, less investment, less incentive to create programs to directly support that named community. But because you have the tribal geographic overlay, you know where the named community members are. And I thought you had a really helpful map and on one of your slides too, where you sort of looked at the geographic overlay of the lands around Yakima, and then also the low income and tribal lands and sort of these other geographic overlays. So I guess my question is, as you identify cons to the single factor analysis and maybe see where some areas it might not be appropriate for certain vulnerable populations that have had a geographic connection to disinvestment and poverty, how do you plan to sort of cross between those two analyses to get the best results?
You raise a good point. I guess I would first point out we use the survey data to track impacts. In Lee, jump in if I go astray here, but we use the survey data to track impacts against the vulnerable populations because we don't have another way to really determine when we are impacting those groups, because as Lee mentioned, we don't have that kind of data on our customers. For the highly impacted communities and geographic subsets within that, the tribal lands, it's easier to track impacts because all you have to know is where the impact happened. And then you can say, was it in a highly impacted community or was it on tribal lands or not? So we use different data sources for tracking impacts in the two different types of named community. And then, I mean, I think you're kind of highlighting, I think you raise a good point with your example. If we were, relying entirely on surveys to track impacts for some of those smaller communities, the survey is an imperfect tool, and that's one of the cons, I guess, of that approach. I don't know, Lee, if you have any other thoughts on that.
No, I think there was also a question about whether, like, how do we see, I don't know, maybe could you rephrase the question? I'm sorry. Can you rephrase the question just a little bit for me?
No problem, and thanks for that clarity, Laura. I guess I'm wondering how you, and maybe I'm already thinking ahead to what this data is used for, but I'm wondering how you move between the geographic and the survey data, to come up with solutions that fit different populations.
Yeah, I think that's going to be probably coming attractions for the next vulnerable population workshop. This particular workshop, we're just kind of like setting the table and talking about the issues that we're going to have to work through. The next workshop in August, we're going to start getting into like, all right, here's one option, take a geographic approach. We could use these particular criteria and look at it through that lens to see what that looks like. More of a geographic approach, not to say that this is the answer. It's more of a, here's a possible answer, right? A way we could approach the vulnerable population construct. It's not necessarily something, we're saying, this is it. It's more of a, here's an option for us to work through and look at and talk about. Does this make sense? So I guess it's a bit premature for me to answer that question, just to say that, you know, we are going to be looking at it in the next workshop.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Lee, for chiming in. Thanks, Elijah, for asking the question. I think it's a good question. And we'll make sure that it's in the notes and that we bring it to the surface at the beginning of the August workshop so that we sort of have the feedback and questions that folk have already asked. Any other questions or comments on this second question that's on the screen? Sorry, Moose thinks that he has a comment on that. But jumping right ahead, let's go to the third question, which is the geographic approach question. In a geographic approach, what factors are important for right-sizing granularity analysis? And I think this might actually come a little bit to the questions that have been sort of asked in the discussion we've had thus far. So how zoomed in works for right-sizing that analysis? I'm going to pose that to the group.
And this might be a little technical, but kind of just looking for any guidance folks would have on how we should think about this, how we should go about it if we move to a more geographic approach.
This is Heather again, UTC staff. For PacifiCorp in particular, it I guess it makes sense to me personally that too much disaggregation wouldn't say much because your service territory is already so small in Washington State anyways. So I don't know what that says about the right size for granularity of analysis. But for instance, I think the population percentage of low-income customers is pretty high. So I don't know if you'd get much by trying to disaggregate that further. Yeah, that's what occurs to me in this moment anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's helpful, Heather. Thank you. And I see that Lee responded to the question about the response rate to the survey, which he said in the chat, which was 4.7%. Thanks, Lee, for hunting for that. Any other comments that folks have about the geographic approach and sort of factors for right sizing this?
Hi, everyone. This is Charlie with NWEC again. I don't have a fully fledged thought here, but I thought it was worth bringing up. I'm curious, PacifiCorp team, when you were chatting with PSC about their methodology, if you got into the conversation about, I think they're kind of referring to it as like their cluster analysis, in which so part of their geographic approach, and I'm probably going to mess up their exact methodology here, but I think the idea is they're trying to identify as granular as possible, but it's hard for them to get like household or individual household data. So what they're doing is when they find certain areas, and I forget at which scale, that have proven to be a part of whatever list of vulnerable population factors that they're using, they kind of see a frequency pop up in a geographic area, and they might then say like, okay, we didn't survey all of the households here, but we kind of see that there's a higher concentration in this particular census tract or whatever geographic designation. So we're going to assume that a larger area surrounding this cluster also will be designated as a vulnerable population. Yeah, I think that's what they're doing, and I'm just curious if you guys had that conversation with PSE.
I've spoken with folks at PSC over the, I don't know, the course of the last 2 years. Perhaps that discussion's come up. It doesn't ring a bell, that specific methodology.
Mhm.
So I apologize. I don't know exactly how they're doing that, or if all the nuance to that approach. I'm sorry, I just don't know, Charlie. But it might be
No worries.
worth a discussion with Ryan and see what he has to offer up on that at PSC.
Yeah, no worries. That was that wasn't part of the original VP methodology. It kind of came up through discussion with their advisory group in the past, I don't know, towards the end of last year, I think. So and Brian, yeah, he was leading that. So I would say it's worth checking out just to kind of see what they're doing. Thanks, Lee.
Yeah, thanks for the input.
Thanks, Charlie. We'll follow up on that. Any other comments on this third question? Feel free to just come off mute or raise your hand, whichever is easier.
Yeah, I'll just jump in again. This is Elijah. I had a kind of thinking about this granularity piece, and you had mentioned a concern with geographic areas around, sort of like pockets. I think was the word you used, of where you're sort of gathering everyone together and assuming a certain homogeneity. But I guess I sort of think there can be a risk of having too fine a granularity, in some sense too, because you're talking about community investment, community experiences of poverty, community experiences of health effects. And so in some sense, I think the sort of pocket scope could be whatever that ends up being geographically, but identifying it as a sort of community bubble, neighborhood bubble, might actually be positive for thinking about where geographically do we need to make investment, where is there a kind of community scale impact. If you have a trailer park that's right next to very expensive homes, that might not be as useful, but still, you're still going to capture then the people who are in that community who, as a group, are experiencing inequality. So my suggestion would be to look for identifiable bubbles, actually, to supplement your survey results, like Charlie mentioned, where you can sort of say, all right, we can call this area a region. What scale that'll be, I'm not sure, but it's just something to think about. Thanks.
Thanks, Elijah.
Thank you.
And I see that Sandra agrees with Elijah's point, plus here in the chat. So we appreciate that as well.
Hi, this is Alessandra with the plus. I'm also a policy associate with the Northwest Energy Coalition, and I guess one of my questions I had was mostly, if we're thinking about this as investments to communities, I really agree with Elijah's point there of being able to have kind of those bubbles or there's pockets to be able to inform those investments. And in regards to survey results and having more success in the rate of which people are filling those out, I'm curious how many of that, I think community organizing kind of skills and outreach is really important when it comes to kind of gathering surveys or lived experiences. And so how much of that outreach is in person at different events, if there's different like school district events or community events, direct service events, to be able to collect more of those surveys in these what y'all call like hard to reach areas. So wanting to see like how are people receiving those surveys, and are y'all doing some of the more in-person approach?
I'll take, yeah, so on the survey
Okay.
survey aspect, we have so this we do a phone survey and we do a email survey. I want to say it was like 300 phone surveys. Phone surveys are expensive. They take quite a bit of money, more so than doing just email approach. And but anyway, we decided that we certainly needed to do that to get to reach out in that using that method. So that's one thing we did approach. In prior survey efforts around the CEIP, we had reached out to our equity advisory groups, folks in that group to see if they could help us to get those surveys out to folks in the community. It did not. It didn't go well. We did not get many responses back using that approach. We did try, but we appreciate the efforts, but we just didn't see the response that we were hoping to see from that effort. So I guess in summary, we've tried. Might need to try again with a different approach, but different sorts of community events perhaps. But anyway, it's something we've wrestled with, and I hear you that we might think of other ways to wrestle with it in the future.
Thank you for the question, Alessandra. That's helpful. Thanks, Lee, for the response.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't see anybody else coming off mute, so why don't we move to our last question before our break? So I think this kind of goes to a comment that Elijah made earlier, but what are the important considerations for ensuring the drivers of different outcomes are clearly identified, right? So Laura, do you want to add some color here to the specific kind of information you're looking for from the group on this question?
Sure. Yeah, this was a question I had when I was kind of looking at the pros and cons list, and one thing that we felt was a benefit to the single factor approach is that we can look across different factors and see how trend lines might move differently, which can be an indicator that if a particular group is having a different outcome than another group, then income or renter status or language status, you can start to see that might be a driver of the difference. In a geographic approach where you've got a certain area that's experiencing a lot of different issues and you're tracking outcomes against areas that have less of those issues. I mean, obviously there are ways, but it seems like if all you have is just the kind of single sheet with the data, it might be harder to see what is driving those two areas, what specifically is driving different outcomes in those two areas. So I just wanted to know if other folks have any thoughts around that. If that makes sense.
I think it does. Hopefully for the rest of the group as well. Let's pause for a moment and see if anybody would like to dive into the conversation here.
I've got another thought. Sorry, I'm chatty this morning, but thanks, Laura. Yeah, you had a really helpful slide. I thought with different communities and then some percentages over time, for each of the different single factor named communities, and I thought that was very helpful. And one thing that you might consider, and maybe you already are, and so I'm getting ahead of this, but is thinking about like maybe how some of those different named communities, how you can track benefits too. If you're thinking about community benefit indicators as well, or customer benefit indicators, you know, if maybe it's too fine a granularity, but if you could see, here's how much EE investment is going to different communities over time, and you can see how that changes. That might be what you're describing, but that's a little bit more on the benefit side as opposed to on the you know, the sort of impact side. But yeah, I think it's helpful for tracking investment and tracking uptake and how communities receive.
Yeah, I guess you just get sort of different perspectives from each.
Awesome. Thanks, Elijah. And don't feel bad about it. It's not being too chatty. You are always welcome to engage in these spaces. That's the point of them. So don't feel like you're hogging the mic. It's perfectly okay. Any other comments on this last question?
Or do people just have other comments? I mean, these were some questions that we hoped would kind of prompt some thoughtful responses, and they have, so thank you very much for that. But there are a lot of other ways to look at this. We got a lot of comments on this approach during the settlement process, and I think that's one of the reasons that we wanted to take some time to dig into it in this workshop. So we just want to be open to whatever folks have to say about it. And then, you know, we will have our second workshop where we dig into the kind of technical details of the data and the specific factors a little bit more too. So, but
Heather, I see your hands up.
Yeah, and I have low bandwidth, so I apologize if this comes out kind of splotchy. Something I'm hearing a lot of the comments move towards is I think large companies, you know, state agencies think of meeting policy as sort of a math exercise, because that's how we frankly need to get things done. And it's sort of our job to start with the big picture and move smaller. And so I'm not offering this as a critique, but more as an observation that it seems to me the hope is that relationship building might lead to being able to identify key folks and key communities and key neighborhoods that go way beyond where you're going to get certain data from, you know, which third party are you going to purchase census improved data from, what software are you going to use going to aggregate, but, you know, who are sort of the key folks in your service territory that you have relationships with, without whom it would probably be impossible to show that you're meeting the objectives of CETA. Even if you did do all the math and had the right granularity of data analysis, you know, if you don't have key relationships with certain folks in your service territory, it's hard to do anything meaningfully. And so I say this as someone who's, you know, been seeing this across companies, including consumer-owned utilities, right, who are also subject to CETA. They're getting a lot of pushback that you're not doing enough. And they're like, here's the thing, everyone in our service territory is low income. We have 5,000 members. We have relationships with all of them. It's hard for us to show compliance with policy, given how specifically we work with every member of our service territory. So again, just encouraging you all to think less in terms of how does this data work, and more, how can we show that we have key relationships with key neighborhoods, key groups of people, key organizations that are going to help us do this going forward?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Thank you, Heather. Stefan, I don't want to single you out, but you moved up my screen, and I don't know if that's because you came off mute for just a moment and then remuted yourself. So I'm going to make sure if you were trying to jump in that you get an opportunity to do so.
Oh yeah, no, nothing for me. Thank you, Jeffrey.
No problem. So
Just real
go
quick,
ahead.
I'd like to offer, I appreciate what Heather said there about, and I think just what I think I heard is the human element, right? Not necessarily just the algorithm, the math. Is that true, Heather? Is that kind of what we're getting at? You were getting at there?
Yeah, like I could see, as someone who works for the commission, right? If PAC doesn't have sort of a list of key contacts who work with culturally specific groups in your service territory, or if you do have a list, if you haven't tried to build relationships with folks, that's sort of a flag, right? Is great, you're doing data stuff, you're trying to be comprehensive about it. That's so important, obviously so important. But yeah, the human element is ultimately how this stuff actually leads to results.
Yeah, and I'll put a plug in for our communications. I mean, we stay. I appreciate the comment. I just would. I'll be remiss if I didn't say, our communications team has been pretty on point at trying to communicate with our advisory group, and I'm sure y'all have seen those presentations and such. But there's always room for illustrating that more so in the things that we do. A lot of the metrics that we have and the CBIs we have are around communications with our vulnerable populations and those sorts of things. So, but I hear you. So thank you for the comment.
Thank you, Lee. I see some comments in. We had some time set aside for this discussion today. I feel like it's slowly coming to an end, and that's okay. But I do want to make sure we have one last opportunity.
I'm not sure what other folks are hearing, but it sounds like Jeffrey kind of froze up there.
Yeah.
Let's try it with the video off for a moment. Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. So want to see if there's any last questions or comments, and then we will jump to a break. Seeing none, let's move to the next slide, Morgan. Laura, thank you. Lee, thank you. We're going to take 10 minutes now, but I'll feel a little generous. Why don't we come back at 35 past the hour, because it's easier to remember than 34 past the hour. And we'll come back for a discussion, and I will troubleshoot my internet connection again. Thank you all.
Thanks everybody for the discussion.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and move to the first slide with material on it for integrated resource planning. Yeah, if you could move to the next, there we go. Thank you. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Randy Baker, PacifiCorp's Director of Resource Planning. In this first slide, just recapping where we've been and what we're attempting to achieve today. So in the April meeting, just a short time ago, we covered PacifiCorp's integrated resource planning at a high level, including the planning cycle and some upgraded portfolio results from the recently distributed 2023 IRP update. Today, I want to discuss a few current topics that are being planned for the 2025 IRP. That IRP is anticipated to be published March 31st of next year. And these are topics which are expected to impact the Washington Clean Energy Implementation Plan. So Let's move to the next slide and start with tax credit modeling as a component of federal benefits, really, is what we're talking about for tax credits. So on the left-hand side of this slide, we can see that a key component of federal policy that will ultimately impact CETA and CEIP is tax credits related to the Inflation Reduction Act. On August 16, 2022, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law, aimed at addressing clean energy and climate change. Although the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, covers many types of credits and activities, overwhelmingly the most important component for a long-term 20-year IRP plan are the two types of credits that offset the development and or operations of non-emitting resources. The two kinds of tax credits impact those things in different ways. So referring to the slide at the left, there are two kinds of tax credits if a resource is in service by 12/31/2037. There is the production tax credit, or PTC, and that's based on the megawatt hours of energy produced by a resource. And then there is the investment tax credit, or ITC, which is an upfront tax credit on the build costs of a resource. So loosely speaking, the PTC benefit occurs over time as the resource is used. The ITC benefit occurs upfront and can offset the costs of actually getting the resource in place. And by and large, you got to choose one or the other. The PTC, which is the one that's spread over time, is a 10-year credit that lasts for 10 years, then it goes away. Our modeling in PacifiCorp's integrated resource planning makes use of whichever tax break, the PTC or the ITC, is most favorable to a given technology or circumstance. So for example, the production tax credit may prove the most cost-effective for solar energy. An investment tax credit might provide the most cost savings for a different kind of resource. It could be a battery, it could be wind, it could be anything. But there's a determination that's usually pretty clear-cut as to which one is going to provide the most benefit to a given resource. And that's what we do, is we pick the best one to give every resource its best opportunity. As discussed previously, the IRP model then accounts for these cost savings and offsets when it's selecting which resources should be included in the 20-year long-term plan. Those are the fundamentals of the Inflation Reduction Act. I'll point out here, and I'll probably say it again a little later, that these items will also be discussed in the upcoming June 26th and 27th Integrated Resource Planning public input meeting, which occurs over 2 days. It's coming up next week, and there'll be a lot of information that's relevant to these items presented there as well. Let's move over to the right-hand side of this slide and talk about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the IIJA. On November 21st in 2021, this Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA, was signed into law. The law provides substantial funding for transportation and infrastructure spending, and it offers financing options which may be beneficial to some energy companies and developers. PacifiCorp is busy pursuing these benefits on projects and investments currently on owned resources, and there are investigations happening for applications for all kinds of benefits. That's just to say that PacifiCorp is active in pursuing those. More information will unfold on those activities as we move through the 2025 IRP process. There's a modeling challenge, however, that I'll call out, presented by the fact that PacifiCorp cannot guarantee that the incentives to resource developers will be passed on to PacifiCorp customers. So you've got legislation that gives a cost break or favorable credit or whatever you want to point to for developers to bring resources and offer them up in the market. And what I mean by that is that when PacifiCorp is looking for resources to meet the future needs of its customers, there will be developers who have made their applications with greater or less success, and that's going to reduce their costs. PacifiCorp may or may not see that cost reduction in the prices that are offered to us. Prices for resources have proven to be quite volatile in recent years, and these cost savings and grants, if achieved, can mitigate cost increases that we've seen due to other factors, such as supply issues, material costs. So there are definitely potential benefits there. However, consistent with most IRP planning, our treatment of those potential benefits is conservative, meaning that we don't assume that the benefit will be automatically passed on to customers. The primary impact that we assess for our long-term planning is at this time, our applications for our existing and owned resources with additional impacts being captured in downstream processes. So when we actually have a procurement process, if those savings are realized, we will see that and can make the best decisions about which resources to acquire. Next slide, please. This is a discussion of the EPA's 111D rule. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency on May 9th of this year finalized its standards and guidelines for fossil fuel-fired power plants, issuing new requirements under Rule 111D. The rule addresses emissions from existing coal-fired plants and ensures that new combustion turbines are constructed to minimize greenhouse gas emissions by requiring those plants to achieve emissions that are equivalent to those possible through the use of carbon capture and sequestration technologies. So essentially, it's not restricting the coal fire directly or bringing on of new emitting resources, but is rather saying that they must be either operated in such a way that it brings them in line with what could be achieved with those pollution control technologies, or you have to find another option or a different kind of resource. For the 2025 IRP and the CEIP, we will continue to evaluate a number of options for every thermal resource, that's both coal and gas, on our system. In recent IRP cycles, we have already been evaluating carbon sequestration options and carbon capture technologies. Those are some of the options that we offer to the model. The requirements under 111D may require that we model additional options and constraints. And I could see, for example, modeling a constraint that forces a coal unit to adhere to a dispatch pattern that is the equivalent of applying those technologies. And then the model would make a decision on that basis of which option is the best one in terms of cost and risk. We also model, however, other options, such as the conversion of coal-fueled to gas-fueled operations and resources that use alternative fuels. Ultimately, constraints on unit operations imputed by 111D will impact which options we model and the cost effectiveness of each option, and then that will manifest in the portfolio of resources that are actually selected for long-term planning. I'll also note that in the 2023 IRP and the 2023 IRP updates, we modeled early retirement options for gas plants in addition to coal. We had not done that in earlier cycles of the IRP. Despite modeling that for gas plants, there were no early gas retirements selected. However, it's not out of the question that new policy drivers such as 111D and state policies and other federal legislation might contribute to a different outcome in future studies. I think the 2025 IRP will be very important for seeing how that plays out with the options that we end up modeling. A final note on the 111D rule is just that it has prompted significant resistance. Last I looked, there were something like 27 states and industry groups that had filed suit on 111D. And I don't have the most up-to-date information, but I just want to point out that when we talk about new federal legislation, there's a process where the legislation may get pushback. We've had important stays happen, such as on the ozone transport rule. And so there's a lot that can happen even after a rule is determined or a law is passed. Just something to keep in mind. Moving to the next slide, please. Oh, and I see a hand up. Should I pause here to take questions?
Please, Katie.
Yeah, thanks. Randy, this is Katie Ware representing Renewable Northwest today.
Yeah.
You just mentioned some potential pushback and existing pushback on this legislation, this proposed legislation. I'm wondering if PacifiCorp plans to push back as well.
I'll say honestly, I have no idea. That's not my area of expertise. I haven't heard of anything like that. And that's really all I can say.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Katie. I also would note that they're in the chat. Jacqueline had a comment that said staff would encourage PacifiCorp to review the UTC policy statement on the IRA IIJA docket U-240013 posted on May 3rd, 2024.
All right, thank you. So the next slide is about the maximum customer benefit scenario. And here we see that Washington statute, it's actually WAC 480-100-620.10c, mandates that PacifiCorp run a study for maximum customer benefits. According to the direction, there must be a maximum customer benefit scenario. This sensitivity should model the maximum amount of customer benefits prior to balancing against other goals. The primary goals of an IRP scenario, all else being equal, is minimizing cost and risk. PacifiCorp has interpreted this to mean that we need to examine what benefits might accrue to customers if, for example, costs were no object or were significantly less of a constraint. This isn't to say that in this study, costs don't matter, but rather that it would be good to understand what additional benefits are available and what it might cost to pursue them. In broad terms, if you can realize a lot of benefit for just a little extra cost, that might be a very compelling thing to do. And the modeling that we employ, inherently will make binary decisions to build a resource or not to build a resource, or to operate it or not to operate it, or to use it in this amount or that amount. And so one of the reasons why we run a great many variants and sensitivities and scenarios is so that you get a feel for what kind of benefit may be hiding behind a few extra dollars. For this scenario, the maximum customer benefits, as for any other sensitivity, we start with our base case assumptions. That's the set of assumptions that our best forecasting says are likely to occur in the future. So we take those base case assumptions and we make changes that are appropriate for the new analysis. So this particular slide lays out the key changes for the maximum benefits case that we propose for the 2025 IRP and CEIP, which would be similar to the analysis that we performed for this study, aligned with the 2023 IRP and our most recent studies. So on the first major bullet, one of the key changes is no transmission upgrades. Transmission upgrades can be a very cost-effective and flexible way to bring needed resources onto the grid, including renewable resources. However, increasing customer focus for generation and delivery can avoid building potentially disruptive transmission projects in vulnerable areas. There are pros and cons, higher cost, perhaps a trade-off of less system reliability, but perhaps increased local reliability, the reduction of wires. So in this sensitivity, we assume that we are not going to engage in transmission upgrades in Washington and then let the model solve around that. All DSM regardless of cost. So I'll note here that Washington already includes nearly all DSM due to the inclusion of the social cost of greenhouse gases and other drivers. I hope you're not hearing my cat yelling.
We are, but it's a nice interruption. Maybe they sense that Jacqueline asked a question in the chat that's worth chiming in here that might make sense as you're speaking. She asked, are NEIs being incorporated into the max customer benefit scenario? And if so, how?
Yes, and we've got a couple slides coming up on the NEIs, the non-energy impacts. There is not a change to how they're incorporated for the maximum customer benefit scenario that I'm aware of. The NEIs that are captured are the most and the best NEIs that we can capture at this time. And that will be included as it is for any other scenario. And I'll talk about this a little more in a moment, but the two primary components are the NEI measures that have been incorporated into energy efficiency and the 10% cost discount that's been applied to demand response. And so the maximum customer benefit scenario will see that as well. It's a really good question, and it gets to the point that I was making a moment ago about how we've already, because of the social cost of greenhouse gas requirement for resource selection for Washington, we've already incorporated very nearly the maximum amount of DSM, demand side management resources. And so I'll have a couple of comments on that in the next slide or two. The third sub-bullet under that first point on the maximum customer benefit slide is that the highest model level of private generation or distributed generation is used to offset load. So this assumption means that we assume a very high rate of distributed and private generation adoption, such as private solar and wind. But everything that falls under the auspices of DNV's report on distributed generation applies here, and that we've got a high scenario to represent that. And I'll also just make a side note here that for the June 26, 27 public input meeting that I mentioned that's coming up, I'll mention that again later so that you can see where to link into it if you want to. But DNV is they are the external folks that we have engaged to produce our distributed generation report. They're going to be presenting it at that upcoming meeting next week. So to conclude on this slide, this analysis for maximum customer benefits results in a new, more expensive portfolio, but which may help us to make informed decisions about what might be achieved at a higher cost. And I think that's the fundamental of it.
Awesome. And Jacqueline raised their hand, so I just want to invite Jacqueline to ask their question right now.
Yeah, so the only question I have is that the public input meeting scheduled for 2 days. Which day will DNV be presenting?
Boy, I wish I could tell you with 100% certainty. On Wednesday, Jacqueline, I'm planning on sending out the materials to stakeholders. I just received the DNV slides to put into that deck today. And I think it was like 17 slides. So it's a pretty good chunk. It currently in the schedule falls right around the late to end of the first day. And it's funny you should ask that question, because I was considering whether I need to move it to the second day or not, and I hadn't made that decision yet. But on Wednesday, you should see the materials come out, and it should include at least an indication of which topics will be on each of the 2 days. So hopefully that will be sufficient for you.
Thank you.
All right, next slide, please. So as promised, non-energy impacts. This slide deals with non-energy impacts for energy efficiency and demand response. The next one will deal with all other resources. To start, non-energy impact, or NEI, is an additional benefit for participants, primarily in energy efficiency programs, beyond the cost energy savings. But it can be thought of more broadly as well. These are additional benefits that are not included in the actual energy cost savings at the end of the day. Some of these benefits might be reduced emissions, water savings, comfort, productivity improvements, reduced risk of utility service disruptions, reducing price spikes. It can be fairly comprehensive, and NEIs are also sometimes referred to as non-energy benefits. The DNV report and the information about the CPA, the Conservation Potential Assessment, that's been presented by our Customer Solutions Group, incorporates the discussion of NEIs. But for today, let me go over some of the basics that I've previewed in our discussion just one slide ago. So regarding non-energy impacts in energy efficiency, PacifiCorp mapped the NEIs to energy efficiency measures for Washington, including additional impacts specified by the Regional Technical Forum. The NEIs were primarily sourced from a study performed by DNV for Washington, as I've mentioned. This includes revisions to valuation made with the DSM Advisory Group in 2022. We've recently calculated NEIs of resiliency for weatherization measures that will be included in the 2025 Conservation Potential Assessment. We've already had several meetings featuring the CPA Conservation Potential Assessment. There will be a couple more. It's possible that the report itself will not settle and be available until we are already running models for the 2025 IRP, but it's a considerable amount of coverage for the CPA that's already been presented and performed, and there will be more before we reach end of September, let's say. A literature review, interestingly, found no quantifiable non-energy impacts for demand response as opposed to energy efficiency. However, Washington staff has directed us to account for NEIs for demand response. In the last IRP, demand response costs were derated by 10% in Washington to reflect those non-quantifiable, at least at that time, NEIs. So you can consider that 10% to be a proxy discount on demand response programs, and it makes the assumption that there are benefits to be had. We just have not been able to determine what they are. And this adder was added to the new Conservation Potential Assessment in the 2023 IRP. Right now, as I understand it, it will be part of the CPA for the 2025 IRP. And I don't have any more updated information, but as this discussion continues, I think there will be more information forthcoming. If you're interested in the literature review, this is covered in the 2023 Conservation Potential Assessment and discussion in the 2023 IRP document itself, both volumes 1 and 2. And so You could, if you wanted to, go online where we keep all those materials publicly available and look that up. On the last major bullet, NEIs, it's worth noting, can impact different interests depending on which program or measure is being considered. NEIs were applied to savings in the model by specific measures and distributed to affected parties, which can include the utility can see benefits, customers, participants in individual programs, vulnerable populations, highly impacted communities, and the general public. So as I was saying earlier, with NEIs essentially being anything that one might describe as a non-energy impact, there's a lot you could bring into it, and there are a lot of potential parties who could benefit from it. Next slide, please. So here we just have a short discussion of non-energy impacts for all resources. In addition to demand-side management resources, NEI benefits can accrue to other kinds of resources, including generating resources such as wind and solar renewables. All resources in the IRP are evaluated using the social cost of greenhouse gas emissions as a cost adder equal to the cost per metric ton of carbon dioxide. The social cost of greenhouse gas value can be considered a non-energy impact in that it's an externality associated with certain energy resources. The SCGHG is a monetary value of the net harm to society from greenhouse gas emissions. It is spelled out explicitly by Washington regulations, how it is to be considered and how it is measured. In principle, it includes the value of all climate change impacts, not limited to changes in net agricultural productivity, human health, effects on property, increased flood, natural disaster risk, disruption of energy systems, risk of conflict, environmental migration, and the value of ecosystem services. And that's not an exhaustive list. But the SCGHG conceptually covers a lot of territory, and in that it's evaluating the cost to society.
Randy, I'm going to chime in with a chat question that came in. So on the last slide, it stated that no new transmission would be selected. Is that due to the company assuming costs are not an issue?
That would be back to the maximum customer benefits slide. I'm assuming that that's what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is only for that specific scenario, the maximum customer benefits scenario. And the assumption behind that is that transmission, while it can be cost effective, can also be disruptive. And there are, there's pros and cons to building transmission as opposed to engaging in an alternative solution. So for example, you could build a large transmission line that carries energy across a broad part of PacifiCorp's 6-state system and could provide flexibility, reliability, resiliency to various communities. And that might be the cheapest approach to achieve various goals. But as an alternative, you could locate smaller scale resources very close to communities, for example, avoid putting more wires in the air. That has its own pros and cons. There's a lot of trade-offs. It's more expensive to not do the transmission. And I say that because the way that it is modeled for the IRP is that those transmission projects have a cost. The model is able to recognize the cost of the resources that it pairs with those transmission selections. And what we receive in the portfolio is the optimal least cost, least risk solution. And so if it picked a transmission project with associated resources, assuming that the math is working properly, that is the least cost, least risk solution. But under the maximum customer benefits scenario, if you're willing to pay some amount more, whatever that amount would be, you can avoid some of the downsides to transmission. And so that's what that statement is about. In the bulk of scenarios and studies that are run in an IRP, transmission options are always available to the model, and the model picks the best ones that it can find.
Thank you, Randy. And Jacqueline gave you the thumbs up. I don't know if you can see it on your screen.
Oh, terrific. So
Yeah, I
on
just
that,
had a real quick follow-up to that, sorry. Do you separate out the analysis of new transmission development with upgrades to existing lines, such as reconductoring or other upgrades?
do we separate out that analysis? If I understand what you're getting at, I'll answer it two ways. One is that all options that we supply to the model are considered endogenously, meaning internal to the model and simultaneously. And that's core functionality of these kinds of models. That's what it does. But when you mention reconductoring, that opens up the question of a kind of transmission upgrade that may or may not be included in what we have modeled. In which case, yes, that would belong with our transmission group's analysis. But what I'll say about that is when we receive the transmission options that we're going to model for a particular IRP cycle, there's a whole process behind that where a determination is made for which transmission options, which transmission lines, which transmission upgrades are going to be included in the model. It's impractical to include them all. And because integrated resource planning is a 20-year aggregated proxy-based model, we're really looking for those projects, options, and alternatives that are potentially most impactful for the direction that the company's going to go. We don't get down to, a bus bar level detail or a very small enhancement to a local piece of the transmission infrastructure, unless the transmission group tells us that we should.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Randy,
So
cleared the question. You're good to go.
Okay. So one more comment on that slide on the non-energy impacts for all resources. PacifiCorp has made significant progress in evaluating NEI benefits and continues to consider improvements in capturing and reporting of NEIs. We are open to recommendations and suggestions and certainly questions about that. But I will say it's not a done deal yet. We haven't captured everything that we possibly can, and we know it will evolve. And so we're happy to have you with us in the conversation as we continue to move it forward. Next slide, please. As you may know, we have officially scheduled the distribution of a draft IRP on January 1st, 2025. We consider this to be a very ambitious undertaking that has become possible in light of some hard-won achievements regarding portfolio modeling and the filing of the amended 2023 IRP by May 31st of last year. In order to achieve the objective of a draft at the beginning of this coming year, assumptions need to be locked down by the end of September. And you heard me mention that briefly a little while ago, that's a significant time frame. Because of this change, we've added an additional July public input meeting. And so that's available on the schedule as well. You can see here July 17th and 18th. And we've removed the November and December meetings that would have covered materials that now will be covered prior to September. In the past, some of our meetings have been scheduled for 2 days but really it's been a one-day meeting with an option for the second day to use as needed. I would say about half the time we didn't use the second day in past IRP cycles. I'm anticipating that our remaining public input meetings will all be 2-day meetings. We may not fill the entire day for both those days, but we'll need that time to address all materials in time for the new schedule. So everything that would have been covered under the more extended schedule is still being covered. In fact, we're covering more subjects and material in greater detail than I think we ever have before. But we do need to have assumptions locked down in time to actually perform the modeling and analysis that will feed into the January 1 draft. Next slide, please. So this next slide is just an update on our stakeholder feedback form process. And I will tell you up front that we are trying to catch our breath with stakeholder feedback, the amount of mail that we receive to our integrated resource planning mailbox. We have been updating and evolving our process for those forms, but I will tell you we still have some issues. One of them that I'll be talking about now briefly and at the June 26, 27 meeting is that there was a bug in the technical process that translates the web form that one fills out onto the emailed form that I receive. And the long and short of it is that I don't know for sure which stakeholder feedback forms are meant to be provided publicly versus ones that stakeholders wanted not to be published publicly. So I'm going to be reaching out to everybody who has submitted a stakeholder feedback form so far and confirming what their preferred treatment is. So we will be ramping up the stakeholder feedback form process as the IRP cycle builds momentum. We try to get a response to those forms back to you more or less immediately, but we have fallen behind on that. We have processed to completion, I believe, 8 stakeholder feedback forms at this point. I know that there are at least a handful more that have not been processed yet. I'm going to work as hard as I can to get those done, and I'm hoping to have a more extensive update for the upcoming June public input meeting. I also wanted to point out something that I've said before. If you submit a stakeholder feedback form to us, and please do so, we welcome the input, even though we're trying to keep caught up on it. You may not receive an immediate answer to a question at the time you ask. And it's possible that that's because we're still working on the answer to that question, or it's coming up in a future public input meeting. The part that I want to be sure and improve our diligence and success rate on is getting back to you to let you know that, so that the form isn't just hanging out there and you don't know what's happened with it. So if anybody has been waiting for a response or an update, again, my apologies. We're working on it as best we can. And let's go to the next slide, please. And so here is just additional information if you want to contact us. Upcoming public input meetings, we've got the June and the new July meeting both listed here. If you're looking for public input meeting, workshop presentation and materials, there's a web link you can go to. The stakeholder feedback forms that I just talked about, the IRP mailbox, and that last bullet is where you can find IRP support and studies. And so if you're interested, we've got many of our past IRPs with supporting materials and publicly available supporting data all out there at the website. And you're welcome to have a look and get back to us with any questions you may have. Any follow-up on all of that? All right. Well, thank you very much, folks.
Thank you so much, Randy. We appreciate it. Always learn something new while you talk about the IRP. So with this, I'm going to pass the virtual baton to Ian. Ian, are you there in virtual land? I see you come up.
I am. Yep,
Awesome.
I'm here.
Take it away.
So yeah. Hi, everyone. So I'm Ian Hugendam. I am the manager of the distribution system planning team here at PacifiCorp. And welcome to our the second of our 4 engagements that we have planned for this year. These sessions are designed to introduce our plans to advance distribution system planning within our Washington service areas. Next slide, please. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to start with a brief recap of what we discussed at our last meeting. I'll then provide an overview of the advancements that we have been making in Oregon, and we're going to discuss how we plan to implement similar strategies in Washington. Then we will introduce the concept of non-traditional solutions, or they're also known as non-wire solutions, and explain the importance in our planning process. I will then hand it over to Shauna Thomas, who's joining us here today. She is our program specialist on the distribution system planning team, and she will discuss our stakeholder engagement strategy. She will also discuss how our planning efforts or how we see them impacting our community benefit indicators as they have been defined in the Clean Energy Implementation Plan. And then finally, we'll wrap up with the preview of what we are planning to discuss at the upcoming distribution system planning workshops that will be occurring in the remainder for the year. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Actually, you could, I think, proceed 2 slides. All right. Hold on, sorry. To recap our last meeting, we discussed some significant changes in the distribution grid, including the integration of new technologies and generation, increased measurement capabilities, and emerging opportunities for non-traditional solutions. We reviewed some of the baseline data for our Washington service area, highlighting key statistics like substations, circuits, and customer counts. Additionally, we explored the role of SCADA, which is our remote metering technology, and explained how our customer metering technology has been enhancing our distribution system planning efforts. We provided an overview of the current state of distribution system planning in Washington, focusing on our traditional planning process, and then we also discussed what is being required for future distribution system planning advancements that we have agreed to as part of the CEIP settlement conditions that were agreed to by all parties. Proceed 2 slides, please. So in the fall of 2022, the company filed a distribution system plan in Oregon outlining advancements for distribution system planning. And since then, we have been implementing this plan and some of the key changes to our planning process. These are outlined on this slide here. So for non-traditional solutions, we have begun evaluating them as alternatives to traditional wire solutions. These types of solutions involve leveraging energy programs to reduce system loading during peak demand hours, deferring the need to increase system capacity. Implementing these types of solutions requires collaboration with communities and partners, as well as the development of new programs. So this process takes more time, and we have extended our study horizon from 5 years to 10 years to help identify grids early enough for implementation. In 2023, we studied 2 areas in Oregon, and we identified opportunities for non-traditional solutions. So we're collaborating right now with the Energy Trust of Oregon, and we're determining the cost effectiveness of these solutions right now. So we're beginning to consider resiliency as a critical grid need, and we are defining resiliency as the vulnerability of communities to long duration power disruptions, and the resilience of the grid serving those communities. Solutions to resiliency may involve decreasing community vulnerability or increasing grid resiliency. So, for example, one of the things that we're considering are a concept called resilience hubs. And so if we support a resilience hub in a community that with backup power, we see that as a means to reduce the impact of community vulnerability to prolonged power disruptions. We are beginning a pilot in Oregon to identify opportunities and provide assistance to overcome technical and financial barriers for resilience hub developers. And then we also discussed, or one of the advancements that we've made in Oregon is the use of advanced metering infrastructure data. So we've been exploring the use of this data, and so having access to the AMI data gives us much greater visibility into how power is flowing on the system. And we could use the data to fill in the gaps where we do not have SCADA measurements on our system. It has provided us with a much more granular view into how power is flowing during peak demand periods. AMI also records voltage measurements, and we have been processing and analyzing this data to help us identify modeling errors in our distribution system power flow models and identify power quality issues that customers are experiencing, such as low or high voltage. We've also been making advancements to our load forecasting processes. We see demand being highly correlated to weather extremes in summer and winter, and yearly weather variability can mask our true load growth rates. So our team has been developing weather normalization techniques to remove this variability in weather extremes from year to year, and that has resulted in more accurate load growth rates. We also see electric vehicle and solar adoption as primary drivers for future load and generation on our system, and we've developed methods to account for their incremental adoption rates in our peak and minimum load forecasts. And then finally, the utility for community engagement, the utility has conducted multiple iterations of local community workshops that we've conducted during our study process. And as those have occurred, we've implemented process improvements to more effectively engage with our stakeholders and develop partnerships for non-traditional solutions. Proceed 2 slides, please. So here on this slide, we have some examples of comparing a traditional solution to non-traditional solution alternatives. The grid need that we're considering in this case is illustrated on the traditional solution chart. The orange line represents the capacity of a wire on a distribution circuit, and the blue line represents the anticipated demand being served on that wire during a hot summer day. So notice the demand exceeds the capacity of the wire from about 2 p.m. until late in the evening. This is the period where the demand exceeds the capacity of the wire is what we consider a grid need. The traditional solution to this grid need would be increasing the capacity of the wire by replacing it with a larger one. And we would size the wire so that the capacity would exceed the peak demand anticipated on a hot summer day, and then also have some buffer for future load growth. And then the non-traditional solutions are illustrated on the 2 charts on the right. So we have 2 solutions illustrated here. The first solution is the demand side management solution. And this type of approach would involve having customers sign up for utility programs that would allow the utility to shift demand to off-peak hours. And this this solution would result in higher loading during off-peak hours and lower loading during on-peak hours. So an example of a demand-side management solution is our smart thermostat program, which is now live now. It's called Optimal Time Rewards. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides. And then the second chart illustrates a solar solution. And so in this case, solar alone is not going to be sufficient to address the grid need, as the wire remains overloaded in the evening hours when the sun is down. So even though this solution is not sufficient on its own, it could be part of a multi-layered approach that could include another solution like the demand-side management solution. And we consider combining solutions as we're looking at the solution to grid needs. So the optimal and most cost-effective solution is most likely going to be a combination of multiple non-traditional solution approaches. Proceed to the next slide, please. So here we are showing the outline of how we evaluate and develop non-traditional solutions. So the first part of our process is to apply a screening criteria. So for a grid need to be considered for a non-traditional solution, it must meet 2 screening criteria. The first criteria is a cost threshold. The cost threshold that we used last year as we were doing our studies was set at $200,000. And and then the other criteria is the timing criteria. So as I mentioned before, the time that it takes to implement a non-traditional solution as we're starting to gain experience in this area is going to take longer. So we're targeting grid needs that are in the 5 to 10 year window. So providing sufficient time for implementation is going to be necessary for implementation of these types of solutions. And then the next step is to look at the feasibility of the solutions. So once the grid need passes the screening criteria, we assess the feasibility of various non-traditional programs in the area. So we consider a program to be feasible if we understand the operational mechanics and have local partners available to assist with the implementation. The next step in our process is to estimate the potential impact of each feasible program on the grid need. We then develop solution options by combining various programs to fully address the grid need. So for example, one option may be to include solar combined with home battery control, while another might be to involve energy efficiency measures and smart thermostat control. So before we compare solutions, we conduct a final round of screening. So we think that solutions must be cost effective for both the utility and the customer, and we must estimate that there's enough interest in participation for the energy programs being proposed to be sufficient to resolve that grid need. Next slide, please. So here are some different types of energy programs that we consider in our non-traditional solutions. So I've talked about solar panels a little bit. Solar panels can help with reducing the net load on distribution equipment by offsetting power demand during the middle of the day when solar output is highest. And so we can collaborate with partners to conduct targeted marketing campaigns to inform customers about available incentives and then connect them with trusted installers. So for energy efficiency, we've found that energy efficiency can be a highly effective, cost-effective, and beneficial solution for both the customer and the utility. We do have a lot of experience in this area. Increasing energy efficiency in an area can be accomplished by focused engagement and marketing to educate customers about incentives and the benefits of improving their home energy efficiency. So some examples of energy efficiency improvement include things like replacing old appliances with newer, more efficient ones, or enhancing home insulation, or replacing incandescent light bulbs with LED light bulbs. And then for demand response, we are beginning to establish more programs in this area. These programs provide incentives to customers in exchange for allowing the utility to control the customers behind the meter devices, such as home batteries, smart thermostats, water heaters, and electric vehicle chargers. So the utility would control these devices during periods of grid strain. And so, for example, we could raise the temperature set point on a smart thermostat a few degrees during peak demand periods to reduce the consumption of air conditioners. And our final category here that we consider is partnerships. And this category includes unique solutions that involve partnering with individual customers or smaller groups of participants. Partnerships can encompass a variety of tailored approaches depending on the specific needs and the opportunities within a community. Next slide, please. So here are some of the programs that we currently offer for our demand response programs. So Optimal Time Rewards is now live in Washington, and there are two components to that program. There's a smart thermostat program. So in Oregon, there are rebates available through the Energy Trust of Oregon. I believe there are also rebates available in Washington. I'm not entirely sure. Laura may be able to answer that question. But I think there are available incentives in Washington as well. And then we have a water heater program, which is currently only for multifamily homes. And the way these programs work is that there is an initial enrollment incentive for signing up for the program. And then there's an ongoing annual incentive for continued participation. And then we also have a commercial and industrial demand response program. And so this is similar to our Optimal Time Rewards program. There can be an automated, component where the utility has communication to customer devices, but there's also another component where, we can notify customers that we need them to curtail their usage. And we provide incentives based on the advanced notification that we provide and the amount that they are able to curtail. There is also a time of use rate pilot in Washington. And the way that works is that there are two different rates. There's an on-peak rate, which is 12 cents per kilowatt hours, and there's an off-peak rate, which is 7 cents per kilowatt hour. And there is a first-year guarantee for those who choose to participate in this, that the bill will be no more than 10% it would be under the standard rate. This is a limited pilot right now. I think it's limited to 500 customers that sign up for this. And I do not think there are plans to expand this pilot at this time. I think that for this to be expanded further, it would require expansion of or deployment of advanced metering infrastructure in Washington. Right now, Washington has an AMR system, which is not supportive of this type of rate. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Shauna Thomas, and she will talk about our engagement strategy.
Hi, everybody. Oh, see, there we go. Thank you. Sorry about that. So my microphone on my computer is not working, so I will be speaking from Ian's computer. I'm Shauna Thomas again. So the topics that I'll be covering can be thought of answering 3 questions. How is DSP advancing stakeholder engagement and soliciting input from the community? How is DSP being more transparent with stakeholders in our planning process? And how does DSP impact community benefit indicators? Next slide. So answering that first question, how is DSP advancing stakeholder engagement and soliciting community input? So DSP does this through 5 different avenues of engagement. First, local workshops, statewide workshops, our DSP website and mailbox, working directly with external partners and collaborating with internal stakeholders. What does this look like? So local workshops are held in areas the DSP team is currently studying. Our engineers work with local field engineers to determine potential grid needs in that area. After an initial review is completed, we as a group travel to the area to talk to stakeholders in that community and present our preliminary findings about grid needs and get feedback and address any concerns the community members may have about that information or about that area. We take that feedback information and put it into a database to ensure that all feedback is addressed appropriately. And if there are concerns that the DSP team can't address, we make sure that the community members are connected to subject matter experts. For our state workshops, we cover broader topics to a much larger audience. Here we review the DSP process, such as forecastings, questions, receive input about our high-level goals. So we would consider the CEP engagement series a state workshop. We share, we answer questions, we get community feedback about our process. Our DSP website is our online resource for our stakeholders that include our filings, a DSP map, which has layers of data about the community, such as distributed generation readiness, reliability metrics, and other information. Our website also has resources like our recorded local workshops and previous PowerPoint presentations. It also has our email address, so our stakeholders can email our team directly with any further questions that they have from workshops or just if they've come to our website and have additional questions. Our external partners are subject matter experts or community-based organization that the DSP engages with for better understanding about community concerns, opportunities, and successes of these groups. So an example here is in May, our team traveled to Eastern Washington to participate in one-on-one with our Washington Equity Advisory Group. We heard from varied organizations about the clients they work with, what trends they're seeing in the area, and how the area is recovering from or changing still after COVID. We also heard about programs in place and how we could work with them on outreach and engagement for our workshops. Finally, collaborating with internal stakeholders. This is an opportunity for our team to learn what is important information community members are sharing with our colleagues from other departments and be prepared, cross-reference, or just be a resource to other groups. So in final, all of these ways we're holistically advancing engagement and incorporating all of this information into our process and activities. Next slide. Okay, so here we're asking, how is DSP advancing transparency in our planning? So we present to stakeholders our planning process from a micro level to a macro level, so they have a cohesive and comprehensive understanding of our advancement in processes, how we iterate improvements, and what other activities we're incorporating into our study area reports. So first, there's the local workshop. So we've talked about how we solicit feedback from our stakeholders. Now let's talk about how we are being transparent. Our goal is to make this complex process more accessible to our community members. We present projected grid needs and explain traditional and non-traditional solutions, similar to what Ian has already done, what criteria would be implemented for a non-traditional solution. So an example would be when a non-traditional solution is layered, and we present on all the programs that would be included in that layered approach for that area, how much load we would be offsetting. And what this means for the community, it is a brief and more accessible way to be transparent with what we're seeing and what solutions we would be able to have. So at our statewide workshop, we review processes and strategies. We share findings that we've had from our study areas, from workshops, and the progress we're making on our near-term action plan, and what we're proposing, what the future looks like. So this is an example from our last workshop that we had in here in Oregon. We reviewed our progress on objectives we had in our near-term action plan, timelines for completion, and updates on our study area selection process. Our fourth avenue is our DSP study report. So traditionally, these reports are created by field engineers in the local area. These are internal reports that are granular documents the company uses to determine potential grid needs and solutions. So we have just completed our first study here in Oregon, and we plan on including that in our DSP filing. Finally, the transparency here with the Clean Energy Implementation Plan. So in the Clean Energy Implementation Plan, the settlement condition states that we should begin DSP in Washington by incorporating all of the learnings from similar efforts in Oregon. So that is one of the reasons that we're here. So to engage with you all in this series, talk about the progress we've made, advancements, and hear input and feedback for potentially how we could have DSP in Washington and then potentially submit that to the UTC. All right, next slide. So finally, how does DSP impact community benefit indicators? So through a stakeholder-oriented process, Pacific Power adopted 9 community benefit indicators and identified associated metrics to track progress for each community benefit indicators. This slide shows all 9 and the benefit categories and metrics used to measure them. We see DSP's primary impact on the highlighted CBIs, but we actually may have a potential to impact additional CBIs with actual non-traditional solutions if and when they're implemented. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about the highlighted CBIs and how DSP directly impacts them. The first CBI is increased community efforts and focused investments. So the metric used for this is workshop on energy-related programs. So the DSP team presents on energy programs at all workshops. So regardless of whether or not these energy programs are implemented in our non-traditional solutions, our layered approach, we still present them to community members so that they know that they have an opportunity to be part of these energy programs. The second CBI is increased participation in company energy and efficiency programs and billing assistance programs. The metric that we use here is the number of household or businesses, including named communities who participate in company energy efficiency programs. So when we think about this, we think that when non-traditional solutions are implemented, we would target all customers on a circuit to participate in efficiency programs or energy programs, thereby increasing the number of households or businesses participating in energy programs or energy efficiency programs. The third CBI is improve efficiency of housing stock and small businesses, including low-income housing. And the metric here, again, number of households and small businesses that participate in energy efficiency programs. So again, a non-traditional solution would target all customers on that circuit to participate in energy efficiency programs. The fourth CBI is reduced frequency and duration of energy outages. The metrics here used are SAIDI, which stands for System Average Interruption Duration Index, which is a measure of the duration of an outage. System Average Interruption Frequency, which measures the frequency of the outage. And then Customer Average Interruption Duration Index, a mouthful there, which focuses on the average time of restoration. So when the DSP reviews or creates their study report, they review the reliability metrics as part of that study report. And when we find reliability issues, those are considered as potential grid needs and are addressed by improving the reliability in the area. Additionally, when the DSP team is looking at an area, we may consider energy resiliency partnerships if we see an opportunity. So in conclusion, DSP is advancing engagement, increasing transparency throughout the planning process, and positively impacting community benefits through targeted and collaborative efforts. I'll now hand it back to Ian.
All right. Next slide. So here are the remaining workshops that we have planned for this year. So our next workshop will be in August, and we plan to talk about some of the differences that we have in Oregon and Washington and what that means for our planning. We also plan to talk more about the importance of AMI and SCADA as it plays a role in our planning process. And then we plan to dive a little bit deeper into how we are defining and measuring resiliency. And then for our final workshop, we plan to share any feedback that we have received from these engagements and how that is being incorporated into our plans to advance distribution system planning in Washington. And we'll kind of lay out our roadmap for the next steps in beginning distribution system planning in Washington. And we'll also discuss how we plan to incorporate resources that are generation resources on the distribution system that are not owned or controlled by the company. And the next steps after that is that we will document our plans in the 2025 CEIP filing, incorporating the feedback that we've received from these workshops. And that is all we have for today.
Thank you, Ian. Are there any questions for Ian or Shauna? Okay, seeing none, let's jump forward, please, Morgan. So I do want to take an opportunity to ensure that there's an opportunity for public comment today. We know that this is a public engagement space, and not always do we have things on the agenda that folks in the room would like to talk about. So I'd like to give an opportunity for folks to come off mute or place into chat any public comment they'd like to leave as part of today's meeting. And I'm watching chat and the mute buttons. I don't see any. We can jump forward, please, Morgan. So I do want to just take a moment as we close out to acknowledge our next steps as a group and as this engagement space. So for upcoming opportunities, the next Equity Advisory Group meeting is on July 11th. That is online. The Zoom link is there. There will be a Vulnerable Populations Workshop #2 in August. We've gathered the folks that typed 1 into the chat earlier to make sure that you're on the distribution list as that date is finalized, so that you get information as soon as that's posted to the Pacific Power website. And then we'll also have the CEIP Engagement Series meeting #3. I do have one breaking announcement that this evening there will be a Yakima Wildfire Forum logistics from 5:30 to 7:30. It is available to live stream, and I just placed the Zoom link in the chat for that. On the right-hand side of the slide, I do want to also acknowledge that many of the items that we discussed today are available to view online as you have questions, etc., as well as we've provided the email address for Rohini. And as we close out, I just want to call on Rohini and see if there are any last minute or closing comments that you have for our space today.
Thank you, Jeffrey. No, once again, I just really want to thank everyone for joining us today. I do also want to mention, so as Jeffrey mentioned, we will have our 3rd CEIP Engagement Series meeting in August. We expect to have at least 1, if not 2 more meetings again after that to close out 2024. We do understand that it's best for people to have this information as soon as possible. We admit that due to organizational struggles on our end and some changes that we are dealing with, which is why you might even see some new faces here. We are really trying to get everything together so that we are able to release our calendars sooner and have our dates set in stone so that there's no moving that around. And we are committed to getting that information out to stakeholders as soon as possible. So if you did not receive an email about this meeting from the distribution list, please feel free to send me an email. My information is on this slide, and let us know that you'd like to be on that distribution list so that you are informed as soon as we're able about upcoming engagement series, meeting slides as they're available. And I do believe we will post recordings of all of these meetings online afterwards as well. Everything is always located pretty much in the same spot on our website. But again, you're welcome to email me and reach out for more information or to request information in the future. And I just really want to thank everyone for a really wonderful discussion today. I think a lot of really important topics were covered, and I look forward to more of this in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rohini, and thank you all for attending. That will be the end of today's meeting. Reach out if you have any questions. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.